manage weed communities. So approaching the agricultural system as an ecological habitat, understanding how weed communities respond to different management or environmental levers. So instead of trying to control species A in crop X, trying to manage the whole community in a sustainable way. And the second big idea that frames my thinking is actually more weed diversity is a good thing, not just for environmental goals, but also agronomically. That a more diverse weed community will be less competitive in any given crop and will also be indicative of a more sustainable agricultural system overall, a healthier soil, a more diverse rotation, a more diverse management regime. So they're kind of the big ideas that frame my work. I should say I can't see my slides very well, so hopefully that what I'm saying bears some resemblance to what's on the screen. So that's not mine, so let's move on. So the big idea is weed diversity and managing weed diversity and keeping them guessing. So by mixing up the system and having a very diverse management system, a longer rotation, more different options in our weed management toolbox, we keep the weeds guessing and we avoid this problem of selecting for the best adapted weed for our system. The reason we've got such a big problem with blackgrass at the moment is because we've almost designed our cropping system for blackgrass. It's perfectly adapted. Take away all the problems with herbicide resistance, it's actually perfectly adapted to our winter cropping based rotation. So that's why it's doing so well. So if we mix things up, we can keep the weeds guessing, and that inevitably leads to greater diversity, which could be a good thing also environmentally. You probably can't read this from the back anyway, but that basically says what I've already summarised, that more simplified systems have led to a real problem with certain really pernicious weeds. So we need to diversify weed management. A more diverse system reduces the risk of resistance evolving, and also you can get resistance to cultural control options as well. It's not just herbicides and chemical options, we can also get resistance to other things. It also leads to greater biodiversity benefits. We can get some more declining weeds in there. And so the focus of my talk, given that background, is can we predict those changes in the weed community if we change the management? So if we alter the levers that we're pulling, we change the crops we grow, we perhaps use mechanical weed control instead of herbicides, mix up the kind of fertilizers we use, can we predict the response of the weed communities? So this slide just illustrates that weed management is really complicated. Do you know, if you're basing your weed management just on herbicides, it's not particularly, but then you end up with herbicide resistance. So if we're going to do weed management properly, as Lynn has already said, and do it sustainably, it's actually really complicated. It's knowledge intensive. And this is a slide that's been produced by an EU-funded project called IWM Praise, Integrated Weed Management Praise. You can Google it and look it up. That's across a range of European partners, and we're trying to pool our knowledge on integrated weed management and on sustainable weed management. And we started off by brainstorming all the possible options, all the possible tools we've got in the toolbox to control or manage weeds. And I'm not expecting you to read all these, but it just demonstrates that there's lots of different things out there. Lynn summarised a lot of them, changing the cultivation, using cover crops, competitive crop cultivars, perhaps stale seed beds, a lot of different things that we can use to supplement herbicides to make the system more diverse and more manageable. But because it's very knowledge intensive and very complicated, actually understanding the effects on the weeds is not straightforward. We're not just saying, well, this chemical controls blackgrass, therefore I'll spray that and expect it to be controlled. If we mix up all these things, it's not necessarily obvious what's going to happen to the weed community. This second slide just shows, has just sized the bubbles according to what farmers are currently doing. So as researchers, we brainstormed all the possible options for integrated weed management. Then we went out and did farmer interviews, and this is kind of what people are doing now. And you can see, obviously, herbicides are very dominant in terms of weed control. Then there's weed seed collection, presumably that's hand roguing. Tillage is being used quite a lot to control weeds. But the point of this slide is there's lots of bubbles on there that aren't currently being used, currently being implemented in weed management strategies that could be. So there's lots of potential to diversify the system and lots of potential to make it perhaps more sustainable. And then that's the key question is, if you change your system, if you change your rotation, how will the weeds respond to that? And that's really what I'm working on. So it's this idea of many little hammers, which you're probably familiar with. So in moving away from the herbicide can and relying completely on that big sledgehammer to try and crack the problem, we now have to use lots of little hammers around the whole of the weed life cycle to try and keep on top of not just one species, but multiple species and make the system more diverse. And this is exactly the same thing that Lynn has just presented, showing that there are different stages in the weed life cycle that you need to hit with those hammers. And the point of my little presentation here is that different weed species will respond to those hammers in a different way because of differences in their biology. And if you understand their biology, then you will understand how changing one of those hammers will influence one weed compared to another one. So what I've done here is I've compared two weed species with slightly different biology and showed how the size of the hammer differs according to the biology. So what this is blackgrass, which you're all familiar with. And if we just run quickly around the life cycle, you've got seeds in the seed bank, you've got seedlings that emerge, then mature plants that are producing fresh seeds. And with blackgrass, the big opportunity is to try and run down the seed bank. And that's because it has a relatively short-lived seed bank. The seed bank declines at about 70% a year. So if you focus your efforts on running down the seed bank using stale seed beds or flushing out seedlings and then killing them mechanically or chemically, then you have an opportunity to really drive down the population. So the hammer is big there. Interestingly, there's a little hammer on the top right on seed collection, or trying to reduce seed return of mature plants. So you saw the Harrington seed destructor in Lynn's talk that's used in Australia a lot for ryegrass. That works really well because at harvest, a lot of the seed is still on the plant. So if you go through with the combine and you collect that seed and you destroy it, then that controls the population very well. You've got a very big hammer there. With blackgrass, at harvest, about 80% of the seed is shed and is already on the floor. So collecting that remainder doesn't have as much of an effect on the biology and on the population dynamics of this species. So again, understanding the biology of the species is crucial for understanding the size of your hammer and the potential impact of that intervention and that management. So with blackgrass, we say focus on the seed bank. This is wild oats. And wild oats is different because its biology is subtly different. So actually the seed bank of wild oats is slightly more persistent. It hangs around for longer, but it matures later and a lot of the seed is still on the seed head at harvest, so there's an opportunity to hand rogue or go through and prevent that seed return. So the hammer is slightly bigger over there. So there's a contrast between the blackgrass and the wild oats in terms of its response to these different integrated weed management options. So if you mix up the different things, you should be able to predict how the different species will respond. And you could extend that to 5, 10, 20, or the whole of the weed flora and say, well, if I change my rotation, I change my cultivation, how might the weed community change? This just illustrates what I said in terms of the contrasting biology of the two species. This is the seed bank decline of blackgrass and wild oats and shows they respond differently. And this is the phenology, or the development of the different species. I'll just highlight this little link down here. It's a weed encyclopedia. Yes, sorry. I tend to wander around. It's a weed encyclopedia that ADAS hosts. It's a really useful resource that gives you summaries of weed biology and some of these traits, I would call them, that I've been talking about. Okay, so this is my last slide. And this is illustrating the whole concept. And a lot of the work that I'm doing at the moment is around this. So if we understand the biology of the different species, we understand how they respond to different management interventions, and we change the management and we change the combination of management that we use, it's as if we're putting the weed community through a big sieve. And the sieve is our management template or our habitat template. So we're putting all the weed species in the top. And if we can understand the different biology of those species and how they respond to those individual management interventions and the combination of those management interventions, we should be able to predict the species that come out of the bottom. Now, obviously, if you've got a very simple sieve, so that you've only got a few holes of a certain shape that only certain weed species can get through, you end up with just a few species at the bottom, but potentially lots of them, and they become very difficult to control because they're really well adapted to that system. But if your sieve is very diverse and has got lots of different shaped holes, so you've got functionally different crops in the rotation, you mix up your cultivation, you mix up your legumes with your non-legumes, that kind of thing, then it produces this very diverse sieve, and you end up with a more diverse weed community. And that should be predictable. And at the moment, we're developing at Rothamsted models and applications which allow you to challenge a system and predict the kind of weeds that you would expect to come out of it. But the big idea I want you to take away with you is diversity of management leads to diversity of weed communities, which is a good thing. It is better to have a more even, diverse weed community, both agronomically and environmentally. And I think that's me finished. Okay?